Hey everyone, this is your APA format citation and style guide. And again, this is tailored a lot to my courses, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's essentially the preferred method of citation and formats with APA-based papers and assignments across the sciences and applied sciences. So with that, let's go. To start off, I want to talk about why we're doing this, and ultimately I am trying to make this presentation about APA citation and my preferred format for your success. So ultimately, we'll kind of get into the finer points as to why we do this, but ultimately this information should be really important to you because we use APA throughout kinesiology, sports science, all the sciences, psychology, any of the non-humanities, I'd say. And kind of as a disclaimer, as we get into this, I already mentioned that this is primarily focused to the format or style that I like seeing in my courses, and again, applies to sciences and applied sciences. But this is also has a date. So as of 2023, any specifics, so not a broad overview or direction or some examples of how APA is done, which I'll provide in this lecture. Rather than just that, I do want to encourage you that anytime you have specifics that you're trying to cover, because it is a specific system, that you go to all the resources I've used for this presentation, which is essentially OWL Purdue. It's an online guide that they'll continually update as the APA or American Psychological Association will update the formatting. As you can imagine, there's things such as like electronic citations, which have needed to be implemented in somewhat recent history, as well as things like AI, which will continue to be updated, I'm sure. So what will we cover in this lecture? Well, like I said, we'll cover the why. Why do you want to know this stuff? Why is it important to know, aside from just helping your grades, I guess, on your paper? We'll go over the basic APA formatting, writing in science. So that's not just how to do APA citation, but I think some general tips for you there. Citations, in particular, in-text citations and how that looks and the preferred method in science. Again, I'd really say that understanding the in-text citation component for your papers, assignments, and presentations will be probably most important because there's a lot of different methods to do that, but one preferred style for the sciences and applied sciences. Then we'll look at some tables, graphs, and pictures, any other visuals that you might need to use. And then finally, and certainly not least, your references or reference page. Okay. So why APA? Well, it does seem like a bit of a picky system and maybe like unnecessarily detailed stuff when you're first just getting into it. I know as an undergrad, that's kind of what I thought. But I think one of the main reasons why APA is so important, aside from just, well, I think one of the important things is essentially acknowledging and giving gratitude. And, you know, anytime that there's these peer-reviewed papers or studies that are done, someone has spent 5 years maybe of their lives that have been dedicated to studying this topic, to writing it, to looking at the methods, doing the statistics. Even if it's a large group of people that are working on a certain paper, there's so many that have done that. And then the peer review process. So once this paper gets published, there's at least 3 other academics that will also go through that paper and ensure that it meets some academic rigor. So there's a lot of people that get involved in these processes. And if nothing else, think of the poor grad student locked away in a lab for 5 years. That's not actually grad school. I highly encourage you to do it. It's good fun if you are curious about a certain topic, but I digress. Recognition has got to be one of the most important things as to why we use citation in this format. The next one is purely just standardization. So how do we reference things purely from a readability standpoint? And when you look at APA, it does allow a lot of flow of reading to occur without interrupting your flow of thought. But it also allows, I think, for this previous part, which is recognition of where that idea came from. And I think that is important for this last point where, our second number one point, where this is science. And so when you're stating a fact, you want your readers to know where these ideas come from. Because quite often, and especially with academic or papers that you would submit as a student, people will look at those citations, look at the idea that was stated to have come from that source. So for example, Johnson and Johnson, year 2000, as your citation. I can look at that, I can look at the references, I can go back to that paper and I can say, well, yeah, you know what? They did support this idea quite a bit and quite well, or maybe they didn't. And that will strengthen or weaken your point that you're trying to make typically. But all of that being said, it allows for this peer-reviewed sort of process to occur within science and for everyone involved, both in writing and reading science, to critique and be mindful of what we're claiming that facts are and how well supported they are or may not be. So just a few pointers. Some of that might resonate with you, some of it might not, but I think at the end of the day, what should resonate with you is this is our system that we've all kind of bought into. And as a personal note for you as a student, one, it protects you from academic dishonesty or keeps your academic integrity is another way of saying that, because any ideas that aren't yours, you properly cite them. And if you do that, an instructor or a peer can't come back to you and be like, hey, you're cheating, you're copying this idea. Are you telling me you came up with the idea of gravity, right? And the constant for that? Well, no, you didn't. You had to look that up. So anytime you have to do that, it protects you from that. And two, there's usually some marks in it for you. So the more automated you make this process, the more familiar it feels to you, the easier it is to get some marks on most assignments. So there you go. This is why I want, it's important to get into this particular system and to understand it well. Okay. The basics. You got to start somewhere. So let's look at the foundations, get it right from the start, and let's take a look at what that looks like. I think one of the most important parts about APA formatting in particular is that you have this kind of foundation of, unless otherwise stated, follow these rules and guidelines. So for example, unless somewhere else on your assignment guideline, it tells you about spacing, the page setup, you know, how, like, is it a standard letter, the 1-inch margins, double spaced, etc. You know what to do by default. It's APA, it's this format, okay? What sort of font are you going to pick? Well, there's very specific fonts that it suggests you to use, and they're all meant for readability and improving communication, right? There's some nuances, a little bit like the page runner and the running head, which I'll get to in a moment. And the title page is a little different, but generally speaking, you have sections that are the title page. You won't always have an abstract, but just keep an eye out for that. We're not going to talk about that here. You're going to have your main body and your references page, okay? And they're all kind of separate. I could add in there potentially appendices. I really love appendices for students and assignments. The main reason is I don't include them in my page count, and everything's typically electronic. So one, we don't waste any paper or trees, and you can include as much extra content in there typically, especially with images and graphs and stuff, which will take up some of your page numbers or page count. Throw it into the appendice, you have lots of room to discuss, and you can just simply refer to your appendice. Okay, so again, if you have like screenshots of biomechanical analysis or something, again, put it as an appendice. Refer to the appendice in your writing. You can't just put it in the appendice and expect your reader or instructor to know what to do with that information. You need to speak about it and to it. But again, once it's cited there, you can just put the larger actual format content in an appendice. Okay, so those are general sections. Here's our format. Well, let's just take a moment to talk about the page header, running head / page number kind of setup. There's some variance as far as instructors on this one. So once you get your title page, if you have a running head, it would be up here at the top and it'd be cap locked. And there's a special format if you're ever requested for this. It's literally cap lock running head. And then it has like a short version of your title following it. Okay, Most assignments don't ask or require that. If you had it and I read it, I'd say, yeah, that's great. You're very particular. Already in my head, I'm getting set up for a great paper because I can see someone's gone through the effort of actually following through with the full APA formatting. But that being said, for assignments, I definitely would never docu-marks necessarily for that anymore unless otherwise stated, especially for undergrad sort of work. This is a good format for that, okay? Again, but once you get into your paper, aside from the title page, which is different than your actual main body of your paper, you'll have your page numbers in the right, and then a shortened version of your title or assignment here, and or group members' names, whatever you want to do for kind of an identifier, okay? Yeah. Once you get into the main body of your paper, I think something important to talk about is the headings. So they have specific formats for your headings and indentation. So usually your very first title of your entire paper might be this, bold centered, page one, before you get going. You have your paragraph, and then any section that's different than that for that. So let me think of an example really quick for you. Uh, Maybe it's your introduction, let's say. So put introduction, you have your text. The next header is going to be flush to the left, so no indent, boldface, and a title case heading. So that means capital little letters, or lowercase as you go throughout. The next one, if you have a paragraph and you want a subheading, so introduction, let's say you have a hypothesis statement here. Following that, you have each point of your hypothesis that you want to contribute to the overall thought. That would be italicized, bold, and title case as well, so on and so forth, depending on how many subsections you want within your writing. Okay. Again, with specifics and details, I always find it's good to just refer back to APA format style guide, Al Purdue, until you just have it second nature to you. And usually that's about third or fourth year it starts becoming just familiar and you don't need to double check on any of the rules. All right, so writing in science. I mentioned clarity already. Well, let's take a look here. One comment I hear often in the sciences and applied sciences from students is, why do I see so many corrections on my paper as far as my grammar? And it's not so much spelling anymore, but like sentence structure, etc. Essentially, things that many feel should be left to English. Well, yes, we are dealing with sciences, but one of the greatest failings of science today is the fact that it has a challenge communicating to the general population and the general public and people not within its area of study. For example, chemists have a very challenging issues at times communicating to humanities. Humanities has, let's say, like art history. Art history majors have a challenge at times. Actually, they're quite good at writing, so maybe I should stick with a sense. Physicists, astrophysicists, have a tough time communicating with exercise scientists on their principles and area of study. So even between areas of specialty in the sciences, there's a great issue, and I'd say probably one of the biggest problems in our modern day era as far as a lack of the sciences, which are doing profound and amazing things today, their incapacity to communicate to the general public in a way that resonates with them. So when, for example, you see a bunch of marks on your paper, especially a science paper, that might be highlighting and providing feedback that you might have a run-on sentence or something, please take that in as feedback and make an attempt to watch and edit for that in the future. I know for myself, unless I have something on the grading rubric, specifically saying something about clarity of communication or grammar or spelling, unless it's there, I won't note it, but it wouldn't affect your grade. But I will say 9 times out of 10, there's something within my grading rubrics that have to do with communication, grammar, clarity, etc. That would affect that mark. So if that's something that's motivating for you, but if nothing else, I hope my next couple of points help highlight this for you. So one of the things that came up, you might recognize this uh, gentleman here on the left. Maybe not. He doesn't have his wild and crazy hair. His tongue isn't sticking out like the pop culture kind of main poster where we normally see him. But sure enough, that's Albert Einstein. And in his younger days, so that's closer to the point in time where he probably actually had discovered or published the theory of relativity, which was one of the foundational marks, foundational studies that he's done and ideas that he put forth. But around that time, and I'm happy to hear if anyone actually finds this source. And I don't recall exactly which one it was, but I remember the article, an opinion piece that was highlighting this. But there was an article in either Time magazine or the New York Times or a really well established and highly published publisher of sort that would have been often read by people in that time. Essentially what it did is it gave an article speaking about Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, the issue with that article when it was framed is it started, I would contest, and there was other supporting events around this, but it started the snowball effect where it framed Einstein's theory as almost beyond comprehensible. It framed Einstein's theory as something that your average Joe probably wouldn't and can't ever understand. Now, the problem with that is when you frame information in that way, people start believing that. And so that was kind of a little bit of a watershed moment, I think, in published history, especially because of the scale and popularity of Einstein and his work, is it started this pervasive thought by the general public that science is too hard to understand, which it truly isn't, as any science student knows. It just takes a little time, maybe some effort to understand concepts, but it's all learnable, right? Which is I think the cruel irony in all of this, and that kind of tipping point, is Albert Einstein himself, someone that many of us consider one of the most popular, prestigious scientists of the modern era, struggled profusely in school. He failed, I think, a handful of his courses, and or just almost failed a lot of them when he was in grade school. It wasn't until he was in about his, I believe, mid 30s, when he was working as with the post office, that he actually he kind of came onto these ideas of physics and this whole new world of science that kind of opened up to him later in life. So he's definitely a late bloomer. And so I also wanted to share that because I think it's important for those of you out there that might feel like you struggle with school sometimes, that that keep persisting, keep your effort up, keep trying, because ultimately not everyone just gets it right away. Even some of the most prolific scientists. In fact, I'd say most graduate students, people with PhDs that I know, while very intelligent and clever and have some sort of capacity that way, a lot of them achieve their goals and get their PhDs through persistence, and commitment and dedication to their science and their curiosity. I don't know if I've ever met a single grad student or someone in a professional degree necessarily that just gets everything, right away. I think a lot of people put a lot of effort. So hopefully that helps put things in perspective too. But to get back on track, so that was kind of like this watershed moment. Einstein's article and interview, and the author kind of putting science concepts out of reach of the general public. And I think amongst issues that have been a bit of a fallout from that is these stats here that we'll see. So this is the question posed for this, and it was along the lines of, how much do you trust science and scientists? And I think in particular, this one might have been medical science in particular, but I think the question was just science broadly. We can see the green is 1975 for that bar graph, and the dark blue or navy blue is 2021. So again, for historical context, although I'm sure many people still remember it now, 2020 was COVID, so this would have been right around probably, I would say, heightened distrust of science and medical science, unfortunately. And I have, this is an American survey, so they always have things divided by politics. And unfortunately, right now, there's a large bipartisan and extreme um, direction and polarity or separation of the two spheres of political choices that you can make within the United States. But I think it also just highlights a number of things for us here. So to get into it, so overall US adults between 1975 and 2021, we can see there's been a decrease overall in the belief of science and the trust of science. Okay. Now, we kind of shuffle over to Democrats in particular. We see that that growth actually increased over the past few years. Independents, maybe we could argue, has decreased a bit, but a very significant decrease in Republicans, where back in 1975, there's a lot of trust in the scientific community and then very little today. And so while I think this speaks a little bit to the politics that have occurred or were occurring in the States in 2021, I think at a larger overall percentage in stats, I think that's reflected there. And this lack of capacity for science to communicate effectively to the general population. So, why did I tell you all the stories and ramble on forever in a unconcise manner, which might have not been best for communication? Trying to get you as much detailed background on this and really trying to pitch to you the idea so that you can decide for yourself, why is English and writing effectively in science important? Okay. And if you still aren't sold on it, I'm always happy to have a discussion about this, but I feel probably a lot of you have bought into the idea that communicating science to the general public effectively and clearly is really important for us moving forward as a cohesive and successful society. Okay. All right. That was a bit of my soapbox, but let's move forward. How do you do that? Okay, Sean, you sold me on being a great writer. How do I go about doing that in my science papers? Well, write plainly, say what you want to say. So these 2 points, I think in particular, I like to highlight in particular for undergraduate students who might not feel overly comfortable with the material all the time, but also might be caught up from, say, high school and maybe even elementary, where, writing in very like colorful or reading up in your reading your thesaurus. I haven't done that forever, but like using your thesaurus checker online or whatever, and trying to come up with this very colorful and large words to show, your power of the English language. Save it for English and creative writing. When you're in the sciences, the nice thing about it is you get to just say what you're trying to say. And so I think the challenge here is to figure that out in your head first before writing it, or writing some notes down on a piece of paper beside you to see very clearly the flow ideas, whatever it happens to be, or when you're going back and reading, doing that as well, okay? Being concise is helpful. Oftentimes I see students trying to fit four ideas. They're trying to connect maybe, but they try to put four different ideas into a sentence, and it becomes a run-on, and it also becomes diluted in what you're actually trying to say. So again, write plainly, say what you want to say as you want to say it. Maybe that means you have to pause and think about that for a minute, but it's definitely worthwhile. Be concise and write for clarity. Remember, you're trying to write a lot of your papers and assignments and doing your presentations for your peers in undergrad. It's even better if, for example, your family can understand you, especially if they don't have a background in whatever discipline you're trying to write a report for. There's some base terms and stuff that they'd probably need to know, but ultimately at the day, if they can kind of figure out and follow along with what you're writing, you're off to a really great place and a really great start. With all of this, and I'm going to circle back to that point about a run-on sentence, I want to briefly, this is a very much of a personal thing, briefly speak about the Oxford comma or and its use, okay? So here's the importance of comma use and why small things like grammar can make a big difference. This is just one way to highlight it. So for example, if we take this sentence, Bob, let's even back up a bit. I'm going to give you a scenario. A friend is, texting you and saying that there's going to be a party on Saturday night or Friday night or whatever, and they want you to bring some stuff with you, or telling you what and who's going to be there. Okay, let's go with that one. And you get a text, and you're like, "Oh, so what's going on or who's going to be at the party?" And they send back, "Bob, a DJ, and a bartender." Okay, so the way that's read is one person. This is Bob, right? So Bob's going to be there. Guess what he does? They're a DJ and a bartender. Okay, Bob, a DJ and a bartender. Okay, that kind of makes sense. But if we put in an Oxford comma, which is before the and, it very clearly starts differentiating and separating these. So Bob, a DJ, and a bartender are all going to be at the party. So now what I'm saying is there's three people instead of one. So again, just one little comma adds a lot of clarity. And so this is the importance of, I think, being mindful about your writing styles, okay? I think the one last thing I'm going to add in here too is the semicolon. I know typically Microsoft Office in particular suggests for a lot of your grammar and stuff or suggested edits include a semicolon. The reason it's doing that is because you're trying to include too many ideas in a single sentence. So what do you do in that case? Write plainly, say what you want, be concise. So instead of having 3 or 4 ideas within one particular sentence, have 2 sentences. Make 3 sentences. You know, you're allowed to have as many sentences as you want. You don't have to fit everything into one sentence, okay? All right. So again, some of these are a little bit specifics. You might hear that there's a little bit of a debate about the use of the Oxford comma. I hope my case I presented to you here, while seemingly simple and obvious, is a good case for that, okay? Okay, great. So we've kind of covered writing in science. Let's talk more specifically how you go about this APA citation format, okay? And the number one thing I want to encourage you to do is to paraphrase. Okay, so yes, you might go to a library session and that library tech will teach you how to cite in all the different formats with APA, in particular, how to do direct quotes from papers and cite accordingly and get the page number in there and then do your references, etc. The one thing that I will say, generally speaking, and again, maybe there's a very prolific quote from something that you want to use somewhere. Generally speaking, in the sciences and applied sciences, avoid the use of direct quotes. Instead, focus on reading content, paraphrasing, digesting, and synthesizing that information in your mind, and then paraphrasing it in your own words back onto the page. Now, this can be a little tricky, but it's one of the powerful aspects of APA, I think, as far as developing critical thought in you, whether you realize it or not while you're trying to do this, okay? So you have to take in information, gurgle it all out, like blend it up in your brain, make sense of it, understand it, and then cite it. And this is why instructors don't mind if you use other people's work. It's because the very process of having to cite entails some time, however brief, digesting and taking the information in, comprehending it before you cite it, okay? And again, in your own words. All right. Yeah, and just, I wanted to put this here because I just think it's funny. So there's an episode, House of Horrors, in The Simpsons. They do their Halloween special, and one of the scenes that they parody is from The Shining, or the whole, actually I don't know if it's directly from that movie, but the general episode is set up to parody The Shining. And Homer is kind of losing his mind, and he's muttering in this room and has written all over the walls, no TV and no beer make Homer go something something, like he couldn't remember the words, right? So again, we're not looking for direct quotes. Paraphrasing and hopefully something a little bit more detailed and specific than something something is ultimately what we're going for. So here's a good example. Again, no direct quotes, but paraphrase and cite. So if the original quote that I want to cite is science rules, of course, that's from Bill Nye. I just found the date of when the first episode was aired, so 1993. So I'm going to say, okay, science rules. Yeah, okay, that's a really excellent peer-reviewed piece of evidence and fact. And again, when you're writing your papers, as instructors, generally speaking, we want to hear your thought, but not specifically opinion. So if you write something without opinion, if you write something without a citation, that's an opinion. You write something with a citation, that's a researched, well-supported, I'll say fact, hesitantly, but fact. So we want to write more towards supported writing and evidence versus less, typically, okay, especially for undergraduate work. So I take this idea, science rules, yes, that's a great, well-supported, peer-reviewed piece of information, and I say, you know what, science is excellent, citation, Nye, 1993. Okay, so this is our in-text citation. So this is the way to go. Last name, year of publication date. Okay, I can take that same bit of information. Okay, science rules, yeah, but maybe it doesn't fit into the wording of my paper as well. So, I can kind of extrapolate that concept, the foundational knowledge that I took from this idea, and say, okay, taking science courses are ideal because science is awesome, right? So that idea was not mine, that science rules or science is awesome or excellent. That idea I got from this paper or this statement here. So I can integrate it a few different ways. And again, both of these are considered paraphrasing. Both of those are using someone else's idea. So for sure, I want to put in the citation in there. Okay. Yeah, there's a few more ways that we can do in-text citations. And just as a reminder, this applies to like PowerPoint presentations as well, the format that I like to see. You can just use this format, which is last name or last names, and the year, okay? And you just put it in smaller print beside the point that you made, and then have a reference slide at the end of your slide deck, okay? I'll come back to that point a couple of times in case you missed it. But what if there's two authors, Sean, not just Bill Nye? We got Neil deGrasse Tyson here. Okay, well, now it's Nye and Tyson, 2023. No Oxford comma when you have the Ampersand. What if there's three? Okay, well, now it's not Tyson and Yu, who is the first Chinese woman, I believe, to have won the Nobel Peace Prize in medicine. Again, date. Okay, what if it's three or more, Sean? I don't want to have to write them all out. I thought you said APA makes it easier for people to read. If I take up 3 lines of text, which is what you used to do, put all the authors in at least once before you shortened it. They've changed that from what I've read. So you just go Nye et al. E-T-A-L. Don't forget the period before the comma, 2023. Okay. So that's great. We have 4 or more authors there with our et al. 3 you can do that way. But I would suggest, okay, what if I have 2 different ideas from 2 different papers and authors that I include in one sentence? How do I do that? Well, that's a great question. Glad you asked. In your mind, and I've read that. I read your mind. We have the semicolon. So that is probably one of the only times that I would want to encourage anyone to use a semicolon in their academic writing, is right there, okay? Okay, last but not least, what happens if you learn something through personal communication, okay? Oftentimes, we can discuss something with someone, we can cite them. So how would we do that? Knowledge through word of mouth is just as valid sometimes if we're speaking with an expert. So what we do, in particular, especially if it's, say, an Indigenous elder, we want to say their name, the nation they're from, where they live, and then this part here is the important part, personal communication and date. let me rephrase that. It's the important information regardless of whether it's, let's say, Indigenous elder, or if it's just, I don't know, me or someone stating something. This component, personal communication and date, always is included. This other information is if it's Indigenous person and their name, of course. Okay, that should really set you up well for your in-text citations, all right? Next up, we're going to look at tables, graphs, and pictures. So for that, here's the general format. You have your figure or table statement. You have the title of said figure or table. And this is sitting between your paragraphs, or, as I like to encourage, in your appendice. And then down here, you have a note. Now, the note should describe what's going on in the table or figure. If you think about this for a minute, if for some reason the image doesn't load as you're looking at a graphic online or a study online, you want to be able to know what was in it. So that's what you put in the note. So a note would be like, in this figure, we have the comparison in four different categories with 3 different variables with varying scores. Okay, so you don't actually have to write all the results in there. You probably highlight something, but normally you don't want to keep, or you do want to keep the writing fairly minimal within the note, okay? Okay, again, double spaced, APA format. Good, and I think this general trend will continue on, especially, yes, if you have an actual image. When you go to send up the appendice or set it up, you have appendix in its own page, starts new, dead center. I will say that if you have multiple appendices, which for different figures and tables, you probably could, especially if you're referring to it throughout your paper, simply go Appendix A, Appendix B, etc., but each has its own page, and you can have the information there, still following the same information, okay? Great. We're almost there for our final component, which is the references page, all right? So this is once you've cited in text, you're gonna have your actual APA citation here. The one thing I'll make note of is a lot of times there's some apps or programs or extensions that you can put on your browser that will copy in a format like APA, the citation, and then go ahead and paste, but you still, I'd strongly suggest go through and edit them. Sometimes they'll have cap-locked journal titles or titles of the journal article or study, and those just need to be changed a little bit. Now, fortunately, it's a little bit copy and pasted for you, but there's, you don't have to write out the whole thing. But there's also one more slight editing thing that you'll need to do, and that's the hanging indent. So I'd say a lot of students, when they just copy and paste their citations, forget to do this. Essentially, the last name in alphabetical order of your authors is how you list your studies. So it's not order at which they arrived or showed up in your writing. It's alphabetical order of people's last names first, of the first author. But that needs to overhang. So the idea is we're just trying to highlight that first author's last name just a little bit. They put in the most time, effort, energy, stress, concern, etc., into these pieces of scientific research. So let's give them a little more credit. So what you do typically to ensure that this part isn't indented here, or that you actually get the hanging indent, you got to go back up to the little ruler slider at the top of the page typically, and you just take your little pointer, which is usually here in line with this, and then they usually face one another, and it's the bottom one that you just drag here to be in line with that ½ hanging over. If it's not exactly ½ I typically don't care. If I've seen the effort to make some sort of a hanging indent, I'm like, yeah, good, that's great. Yeah, so just something to keep in mind when you're doing your references pages. And yeah, titles and subtitles for most books, textbooks, etc. They're going to be italicized, capital for the first title and capital for the first word after whatever divider is there. The exception is journal articles or study titles. For those, you're going to have not bolded or italicized. You're going to have just plain letters, but you will capitalize the first thing after. So the subtitle you're going to capitalize, and any nouns that happen later. The journal title is going to be italicized. So that's the main difference between, say, books, etc., and then journal articles as well. So we'll just take a quick little peek at that, what that looks. So here's our hanging indent. Yes, give a big old check mark to that when I see it. And yeah, we have our italicized journal title, etc., all the pages. One thing I guess I didn't mention yet is including some sort of DOI link, which is very common. Or if you're retrieving this information online, which I think 98% of us are nowadays. No, I think it's very few people that are going to the library to look at these. You just include a link to the full text that you're pulling from, okay? So again, try to help your readers out, being able to track down and review the articles and ensure that your interpretation, when you took the knowledge in, to paraphrase it, was correct, okay? That's definitely something I do, so... I find science and learning new things really interesting. So if you bring up a really great point in your paper, one, I'm stoked on it, but two, I also want to read more. So it's appreciated when that's in there. Saves me some time. And yeah, so wrapping this up, I think, yeah, always check the APA style guide. Again, these are kind of generally what I go off of as of 2023. This for now, off this edition of the APA Citation Style Guide. When you're starting out, you're going to have to refer back to it more often than not. But once you get proficient at it, it is pretty automated, and you can usually write quite smoothly. And you figure out a system where you kind of put your little in-text citations in, and you review it and do your references after, and it gets really smooth and quick. One, I'd already mentioned this, but why do you care about doing this? Well, one, I think probably most important for you, protects you from being identified for any academic dishonesty. The more citations you have, the more obvious it is that you're clearly giving people credit for their work. We definitely want to see you use that because of that. I want to see how many different articles you found, have read at least in part, and that shows to me that yes, you did some background knowledge and research and acquired some knowledge, and have applied it to your paper in some way, shape, or form. Last but not least, paraphrase those things. So again, avoid direct quotes wherever possible, unless it's something truly profound that the author has said and fits really well. Okay, excellent. Thank you for listening. Thank you for trying and giving effort to making sure your APA citations are correct. And all of science thanks you, because you are helping draw recognition to the people that put in time and energy into these endeavors. So